Joe Gallagher from Veritas Education, and this is the debug logging lesson. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the logging assistant, which is an automated method to set up and collect log information in NetBackup. We'll talk about different ways of enabling debug logs, depending on the log type, a little bit about viewing debug logs, and a little bit about log management and preventing them from consuming too much space on the server. And then finally, we'll talk about how to capture debug logs and prepare to send them to support. In this first topic, we'll discuss the logging assistant. The logging assistant is a fairly recent addition to NetBackup. It was added in NetBackup 7.6 and later, and it's designed to address the challenges that backup admins have with managing logs, in particular the fact that they can be very complex due to the number of logs and the fact that they're available in different types. And what we were looking for was a way to assist in the setting up logs, the collection of logs, and getting them uploaded to support. So this is a wizard-driven interface that's run from the NetBackup admin console. You'll see it's got its own node down there at the bottom of the tree called a logging assistant, and you can run wizards from here to perform any of these tasks. And one thing that's nice about this is you don't need to know a great deal about NetBackup logging, or frankly even a great deal about NetBackup in general, to be able to use this assistant. And so this can be a nice tool for frontline operations staff who may not have had as much training in NetBackup as the administrators have, to be able to easily collect and upload logs for analysis without needing to escalate issues to other personnel. This slide shows a high-level overview of steps performed with Logging Assistant. We're going to go through each one of these and take a look at it in more detail. It begins with creating a Logging Assistant record, and then once we have a record created, we can go through and set up debug logging and choose which logs to activate. Then we rerun the job or jobs that are failing so that we capture information in the logs, and then we collect those logs and we upload the log plus possibly other types of evidence to support. Support comes back, tells us what they think the problem is. We can then go through and take some corrective action and run the job again. If the job is now running successfully, awesome. Then we can get back to work. Maybe get rid of the logs that we turned on if we think we don't need them anymore, or maybe set logging to a minimum level. Let's take a look at this step by step. The first step was to create a new Logging Assistant record, and we'll assign a record ID to this, which will usually be a case ID with NetBackup support. And then we can do nothing at this time but create the record, or we can go ahead and take an action such as activating logs. In this example here, we'll choose to just create the record to get the process started. Now that the record has been created, I can start performing tasks. Right-clicking on the record gives me options that are valid to whatever stage of the process I'm in. At this point, all I've really done is create the record. I really haven't done anything yet. So I'm going to right-click on the record and say I'd like to set up some debug logging. The next few screens are going to walk me through the process of selecting which logs to activate. Now, if I'm already working with support, or if I'm an experienced NetBackup troubleshooter, I may already have in mind which logs I want activated. If I do not have that information, if I'm not that familiar with NetBackup, but I have a general idea of what kind of problem it is, I can go through and select the checkboxes that match the symptoms I'm seeing. And so in this example over here, I've got failed backup jobs. I'm getting a status code like a 41 that involves network connections, some kind of communication problem. So I'm checking off the backup box and the network communication box. And you see in the right-hand column, okay, based on those choices, if that's the kind of problem you're having, here's the logs I'm going to activate, because those are the ones that have been proven to be most helpful in those situations. This slide shows the first screen we're presented with, where we're choosing which logs to activate on the master, and then as we hit next in the wizard, subsequent screens will appear, which allow us to activate logs on the media server and the client, if that's going to be necessary, depending on the kind of problem we're troubleshooting. My next step would be to go and rerun the jobs that are failing. In this example here, I guess it's a backup job, and then hopefully lots of good troubleshooting information is going to get captured in the log files. So once the job has failed again, now I can go through back to my Logging Assistant record here, right-click on it, and select Collect and Upload Logs. Once I have uploaded logs to support, They will assist me in resolving the issue. Once the issue has been resolved, I may want to come back to my logging assistant record here and either disable the debug logs or set them down to minimum values. The recommendation from support is not to completely disable the logs, but to run them at a minimal level. And that's because logs can be very handy in troubleshooting problems, and it's very helpful to have at least a minimum level of logging running that can get you a fast resolution to a problem. Now, there are some limitations with using the Logging Assistant tool. One of them is verbosity. The logging tool lets you choose which logs to activate, but not how detailed you want them to be. They're always going to be set to maximum verbosity. And so that means that they'll be space intensive while they're active. And that's why we recommend after your troubleshooting is complete, you may want to go back here and set those logs back down to a minimal level, just to make sure you're not using too much disk space on your servers. Also, not every log file in NetBackup is available from the Logging Assistant. All of the most commonly used log files are, but not every single one of them. So it's possible if there's a particular log file that support needs to really help you out that you may have to create manually. And lastly, disabling logging for unified logs leaves additional logs in nblog.conf file. We'll discuss this file in a little more detail later in this lesson. The additional lines are not usually a big deal unless you or your administrative staff is often in that configuration file. It might be surprised to find them there. In this next topic, we'll discuss how to enable debug logs manually. The first thing to understand about logging in NetBackup is that we can divide the types of logs on NetBackup servers and clients into two broad categories of legacy logs and unified logs. Legacy logs are associated with NetBackup processes that have been in NetBackup for a long, long time. Unified logs are used by newer NetBackup processes. And by newer, it's kind of a relative term. I mean processes that have been added to NetBackup since the last major architectural change, which was back in NetBackup version 6. Now you can generally tell the difference at a glance because the newer processes that use the newer unified logs usually start with NB for NetBackup, such as NBPEM, whereas older legacy processes usually start with something else, oftentimes BP for Backup Plus, which was the way old name of NetBackup many, many moons ago before the product was acquired by Veritas. And so BPRD, the BP there stands for Backup Plus. Now the reason why we make this distinction is because these two methods of logging behave very differently. The legacy logs, the older logging method, is very straightforward and simple. It's easy to activate and deactivate, but there's not a lot of options for management. You can turn these logs on and off, and you can affect how verbose they are, but they're not as configurable as the unified logs. The unified logs have a set of command line utilities that can be used for reading and managing the logs. It addresses, a complaint that we had gotten from customers coming into this big change in version 6. Can you please do something to help us out with these logs? They're consuming a lot of disk space, and we're having difficulty managing them. There is a separate log file in NetBackup for each major process. Now there are some processes that consist of subcomponents or service libraries, and these subsystems write to the calling process log. They don't have their own log file. So for example, the NBEMM is a service container, and so it's got a number of modules that are independently logging. They're all writing to the same log file, but they have a separate originator ID or OID, and so that's something that we can filter on to be able to control the logging levels and to be able to extract information that's specific to just one of the subsystems and not necessarily all of them. Let's take a look at legacy logs in more detail. And so we mentioned that legacy logs are associated with older NetBackup processes and services. Legacy logs are not turned on by default. They must be activated. And even though these are older processes and services, it's not to say that they're less important than the newer ones. In fact, if anything, the opposite is the case. Some of the most critical processes that are used during backups and restores are these older legacy processes, that have been in NetBackup for a long, long time. So some examples on the slide here. BPRD, the request daemon, listening for requests on the master server. The backup and restore manager, a process which runs on the media server, kind of the highest level process really, when it's doing backups and restores. The tape manager process writes our data to tape or to disk. The BCAR process, the main client process during a backup. So this is important stuff. And again, I can tell that these are legacy logs from the name of the process. These all start with BP for Backup Plus, the old name for NetBackup. To enable legacy logs, simply create a directory for the log you wish to enable in the NetBackup logs directory. So here are examples of where to find the NetBackup logs directory in Unix and Windows. The name of the subdirectory you're going to create is the name of the process. So if you want to enable the BPTM log, create a subfolder called BPTM. Then in the host properties, go ahead and set the logging levels. And the way it works in recent versions of NetBackup is that processes will check to see if they should be logging when they first start up or every 60 seconds thereafter. And so if this is a process that kind of comes and goes like BPTM, the next time it starts up, it'll just start logging. If this is a service like BPRD, once this 60-second interval is up, it'll notice that you've done this and start logging. This is a change from the pre-7.6 behavior where you would have to refresh a service in order for it to start logging. So when you go to create the logging directories, rather than just using a shell command or Windows Explorer to do this, it's best if you use the makelogdir. Now makelogdir is a script. It's a script in Unix. It's a batch file in Windows. And the traditional use for this would be to create all possible log files. If you run makelogdir or makelogdir.bat, then flump, every legacy log file there is in NetBackup gets created, about 40 plus of them. Now, rather than just creating all of them, because that's usually going to be overkill, another way to use this script is to use it to enable certain logs. So you can just say makedir bprd, for example, and it'll automatically create a bprd subdirectory, and it will create it with the proper permissions. And that's actually the biggest reason why we recommend this, is to ensure that the folder gets created with the correct permissions. Note that permissions on log files have changed in recent versions of NetBackup. It used to be that these were all worldwide writable 777 directories, and in recent versions we've been clamping down on that to comply with our customers' increased focus on security. Next, from the logging tab, we can set the logging level. In other words, how verbose we want the log to be. Note that there are settings here that will for the global logging level, which will affect all of the debug logs, or for some of the more commonly used debug logs, there are individual settings. So for example, for BPRD, we could set that at a high verbose level and then leave the rest of the verbosity lower for the other logs to conserve disk space. Always remember, if you're going to be sending logs to support, that supports wants to see everything. So if you're sending logs to support, you want level 5 for legacy logs, the maximum. If you're doing your own troubleshooting, on the other hand, and maybe you want to kind of declutter the logs a little bit, anything over level 2 usually winds up being very technical messages, the kind of stuff that's only going to really be helpful to support engineers and developers. So you might consider lowering verbosity if you're going to be going through the logs yourself. As we mentioned before, NetBackup processes will start logging the next time they come up. NetBackup services and daemons will be checking every 60 seconds, and when they notice a directory has been created, they'll automatically start logging. Prior to NetBackup 7.6, we used to have to restart a service or a daemon if we wanted the logging to start. Media Manager processes can also be logged, and these are legacy logs. They're a little bit different than the rest of the logs we've talked about just because they're created in a different path. And so a lot of people sometimes forget these logs exist, and that's too bad because they can be very helpful in troubleshooting device and media related issues. And so I'm going to create the debug directory, which does not exist by default. I have to create it underneath the vol manager directory. You can see the path for Unix and Windows platforms on the slide. And then from that debug directory, I create a subdirectory for the process or processes I want to log. And you'll notice that unlike the other legacy logs, the name of the directory I'm creating does not always exactly match the process or processes that's being logged. so be careful to follow the handy chart they gave you here. Controlling verbosity of Media Manager logs is also a little bit different than other legacy logs. I'm going to add a verbose statement to the vm.conf log, and that applies to all Media Manager logs. And there's only the two settings. There's not different levels like there is with the other legacy logs. When it comes to Media Manager logs, it's either verbose or not. If you're sending logs to support, please send verbose. Let's move on and talk about unified logging a little bit. So unified log is a method that's used by the newer NetBackup processes, and this is a common Veritas logging strategy, which means that there are other Veritas products besides just NetBackup that use unified logs. For example, if you have Storage Foundation installed on the server, you'll have Storage Foundation logs that are unified logs, as well as NetBackup unified logs. So this is an attempt to have a consistent and cohesive behavior for log files across all Veritas applications. And the unified logs come with utilities that make it a little bit easier to manage and a little bit easier to filter out and to work with these log files. They're just a little bit more robust the way they behave. Unified logs are used by newer NetBackup processes, which are usually easily identified by the fact that they'll start with an NB for NetBackup. Unified log files, the names of them are a little bit longer than the legacy logs, and they're very descriptive, so you can identify exactly what you're looking at. And they start with a numerical product ID to identify the product that wrote the log. Remember, again, this is for other products besides just NetBackup. So, for example, 51216 is the product ID for NetBackup. And then there'll be a file ID, which identifies which file we're talking about. Now, these are controlled by the nblog.conf configuration file. And if you were to go to that file, you would be able to see a mapping between these file IDs and the exact processes they correspond to. It's also pretty easy to tell if you actually look at it on a NetBackup server, because these files will be contained in a parent directory, and the parent directory will be named after the process, so that's easy to see. There's a host ID that uniquely identifies the host. There's a date, and there's a rotation in case the log has been rolling over. And so the idea here is we want to be able to send logs to support where the support engineer can look at the name of the file and know immediately what he or she is looking at, and not have to wonder, hey, which server did this log come from, or which process does it come from, the way we sometimes had to with older legacy logs. One of the benefits of unified logs is that there are 3 utilities which ship with NetBackup specifically for working with these logs: VxLogView, VxLogConfig, and VxLogManager. Now we'll have some detailed examples of all 3, but just to start with kind of a high-level overview, VxLogView is used to view the logs and to filter the content so that you can see just the stuff you're looking for. Nice example they have on a slide here, filtering by job ID, just show me the log messages related with this particular backup job. VxLogConfig, which is used to configure the settings for unified logs. And these can be set very granular. You can have different settings for different log files using VxLogConfig. And so, for example, they're going through and changing the settings for a file here, this one associated with the NBEMM process. And note that when you use a command like VxLogConfig, you can identify the product and the originator using either its numeric code or using its name. So I can say 51216 for NetBackup, or I can just say NB. Same thing, I can say originator 111 for NBEMM, or I can just use its name. Most of the time, administrators will refer to processes by their name, not by their number. But you may see tech notes or other entries in NetBackup documentation that refer to the logs by their numerical OIDs instead of the names. They're interchangeable. And then finally, VxLogManager has got 2 functions. It's got a copy function and a delete function. And so you can use that VxLogManager to copy a whole bunch of logs to a temp folder, maybe because you're then going to zip them up and send them to support. Or you can use it for some house cleaning. You can say, I'm running out of disk space on this volume. I think I've got too many log files on here. NetBackup, I'm going to use VxLogManager to find all the logs that are older than 48 hours and delete them, and see if I can't free up some space. Here's some general suggestions about NetBackup logs. If you're going to be working with NetBackup logs, it's very helpful to have a good understanding of NetBackup process flow. And so it's worth reviewing the lessons on process flow in this course. Understanding what the process is doing is key to knowing if its log file will be helpful for you or not. And if you're not really sure where to go, you've reviewed the process model, you've thought about the problem you're having, and you're just not sure where to begin, it's usually best to start at the top and work your way down. So pick the highest level process, the job manager on the master server or BPBRM on the media server, and start there and work your way down. Normally when NetBackup processes run into problems, they'll report the problems they're having upstairs to higher level processes. And so the higher level log might point you towards a lower level log that has the real information you're looking for. Be careful with your log verbosity settings. The more you increase the verbosity, the more detailed the log is, and the more disk space it consumes. If you were to activate every single log there is in NetBackup at maximum verbosity in a busy backup environment, you would chew through an impressive amount of disk space. It is totally possible to fill up a file system with logs on NetBackup servers if you're not careful with your settings. And so when you're doing this, make sure that you're doing enough logging to suit your needs. Again, I don't recommend shutting off the logs completely. Some of them can't even be shut off. At least at a minimal level, it's nice to have the logs always running. But it's not necessary to have them all running at maximum verbosity all the time, for sure. We need a compromise here between having information to do troubleshooting and not running out of disk space. Now, one thing you can do with the unified logs cannot be disabled. They're always going to be running. But you can adjust the verbosity of the really technical messages. The diagnostic and the debug level messages are the really technical ones. By setting them to 0, those messages don't appear in the logs anymore, and you consume vastly less disk space. There are a number of logging utilities that can help with gathering and analyzing log files. We're going to discuss a number of them in this lesson. There's even more documentation available about it in the NetBackup Troubleshooting Guide and in the Logging Reference Guide, which is a recently added manual to the NetBackup manual package and contains very detailed information about debug logs and how they work. In this next topic, we'll talk a little bit about viewing debug logs. Debug logs contain very detailed information about the activity of the processes that we're logging, about messages that are received from other processes, messages that are received from the operating system, and possibly even messages from other applications like third-party vendors, OST plugins, or snapshot providers. So there's a lot of information that's captured here. The debug logs are not usually the first place we look in our troubleshooting process. Actually, a lot of times they're the last place we look. We'll go through and we'll look for the more easily accessible information, like the activity monitor, the troubleshooting, the reports in the admin console, Op Center. We'll gather as much information as we can from those sources first. And hopefully we can get enough information from what I'll call the primary sources to correct our issue. And then if we've gotten as much information as we can, we still don't know what the problem is, we still need more info to fix it, that's when we'll turn to the detailed debug logs to get really detailed troubleshooting information. Knowing where to look is one of the most important factors in working with the detailed debug logs. There's a lot of these logs. Again, there's one per NetBackup process. There's a lot of information in them. So one of the things I'm going to be asking myself when I first get started is which log is most appropriate for the kind of problem I'm having. Now, this slide tries to break down in a very general sense which logs are most relevant and which logs are least relevant for the majority of backup and restore jobs. And so the processes highlighted in blue at the top half of this slide, these are sort of the go-to logs for our support engineers. This is where they'll usually look first for information about problems. When it comes to viewing log contents, the legacy debug logs are text files. They can be viewed by any text editor although they will look best if you're using a text editor that's got at least a minimal amount of formatting capability. So for example, WordPad is better than Notepad, to use a Windows example. And honestly, it's even better if you have something more robust, especially if it has good ability to search and to mark blocks of text. Note that recent versions of NetBackup have made some changes to legacy logs. The permissions have changed. You no longer require world writable permissions for the logs. We're tightening that up a little bit to help comply with customers' increased needs for security. And that means that the names of the log files in 7.7 are slightly different in that the username will be prepended to the name of the log. Here's a detailed look at what we see in legacy logs. This is one entry, one line in the log. And you see it starts with a timestamp, followed by a process ID. And this is a Windows example because you see it also has a thread ID in addition to a process ID. That's Windows only. And then next we see a severity level. The severity level is very useful in filtering out the most critical messages. It indicates how bad a problem NetBackup thinks we're seeing here on this line. And the vast majority of lines in the log are going to be tagged with lower severity levels because they're mostly just informational messages. So these severity levels go up by powers of 2. You can see the reference chart here on the slide. So severity level 4 that's being shown here is informational. It's not likely to be the smoking gun that points out the problem that I'm having. When I want to look for the real big problems where stuff is breaking, I want to search for the higher severity levels. Let's go find some 16s and 32s, because that's where stuff is actually breaking. Remember that with legacy logs, it's very common that there are multiple instances of a process running, especially if there's multiple backup jobs going on at the same time. And that means that multiple processes will be writing to the same log file. And so I'll want to filter out the entries that are associated with the specific backup job I'm having problems with. Now I can determine this by looking at the details in the activity monitor as processes such as BPBRM and BPTM are started to handle a particular job. The process ID of the process that is specific to this job is identified. So for example, I can see here the PID for the BPBRM process that's associated with this particular backup job. Once I know the proper process ID, I can then open up the log file, and I'm going to open it up again in a decent text editor here, and I'm going to mark all of the entries that are associated with that particular process ID, and then I'm going to cut and paste them into a new document. And so now I have just the entries associated with the job that's failing, and it's a lot less information that you're going to have to sift through by doing that. So here's an example of the new text file that I've created. Way less information than was in the original file, specific to the job I was having problems with. And now that I've got all the entries from one process ID in one place, the next thing I'm probably going to do is search by severity to look for the big problems here. And again, the 16s and the 32s will indicate to me where stuff is actually breaking. Now, when it comes to unified logs are also text, but they're a heavily formatted text format. It's kind of compressed looking if you open it up in a very simple text editor like Notepad, or just do a more on the file in Unix. And so you're really going to want to use a decent text editor to look at these. They're not really meant to be viewed directly. Instead, the idea is we'll use the VxLogView command to filter out what we need to see and what we don't need to see, and VxLogView will provide me with a nice human-friendly output. Now that's fine for our own troubleshooting purposes when we're going through extracting info from the logs. Do keep in mind, and we've mentioned this before, if you're sending logs to support, support wants to see everything. So don't send our support guys the output of VxLogView. Send them the raw log file captured at maximum verbosity. Here's an example of the unified log layout, similar to legacy logs, but there's a little more information here. And I've gotten this output using VxLogView with the -d all command. The -d is how you choose which columns are going to be displayed. And so I've chosen all of them. So I see I get a date stamp first, followed by a timestamp, followed by the message type. Now there's three types of messages that you can see in unified logs. There's the application level messages, which are very human friendly, debug level messages, which are very technical, and diagnostic messages, which are kind of in the middle. You know, they're a little more technical than application, but not as technical as debug. So I can see what kind of message this one is here. And then I can see the product identified by its short name and its number. And then I can see the originator, the process or subsystem that wrote this, which is identified by its name and by its originator. Notice that this is the MDS subsystem, which is one of the service libraries that's built into the NBEMM process. So you see a little further along there, after the thread ID is the file ID. This message is being logged to file ID 111, which is associated with the NBEMM process, but it's coming from a particular subsystem. It's coming from MDS, the Media and Device Selection. That's very useful because I can filter on OID, and I can cut out messages from other subsystems that I'm not interested in. You know, if I'm only interested in media and device selection, I may not be interested in what the drive allocator and the other subsystems are doing. Next, I can see the debug or diagnostic level that's associated with this message. And so this is the minimum verbosity at which this message would appear. Note that there's no setting for application messages. Application level messages always appear, no matter what. Can't turn them off. But debug or diagnostic can be adjusted in terms of how detailed the output is, or you can suppress them completely by setting it to level 0. And then there's the actual message, which is the last part here. And so you can see where the VX log view with the -d argument can be very helpful in sort of decluttering your output a little bit. If I was doing this for troubleshooting purposes, if I knew I was looking at a NetBackup log file, maybe I don't want to see the column that identifies the short name and the number of the product, for example. So this kind of stuff can be filtered out by using different arguments with the VX log view -d. If you look in the NetBackup command summary reference guide, you'll see detailed examples of which switches to use to get which columns of data, so that you're only looking at what you want to see and not everything. Here's a detailed example of what I was talking about before, the way that there are different message types in unified logs. The application message type, always present, can't be suppressed, and these are the real, the most human-friendly of all of the messages that I see here. They're usually pretty straightforward. They may not be the key to solving the problem, they're certainly easy to understand. And then the diagnostic message type, a little more detailed than that, and the debug message type, which is the most detailed type of message. And so again, diagnostic and debug can be adjusted. You can regulate the verbosity levels here, and your thinking here should be the same as it was with the unified logs. If you're doing your own troubleshooting, hunting through the logs for information, consider having diagnostic and debug set at lower verbosity levels to cut out the real technical stuff that, I'm probably not going to be able to understand if I'm not a software developer. On the other hand, if I'm sending logs to support, maximum verbosity for diagnostic and debug. Support wants to see everything. So there's a lot of different switches I can use with the VX log view command. Because, although it's called VX log view, most of its function is filtering, so that I see just what I want to see and I don't see everything. Now, we talked already about how the -d switch could be used to decide which columns I want to view. If you take a look at the NetBackup command reference guide, you'll see there's lots of other switches that I can use with VX log view as well. And so, for example, I can sort out, do I just want to see NetBackup messages and not messages from other products? Do I want to just see application messages and not the more technical messages, or vice versa? Maybe I want to set a time filter, just show me messages for the past so many days, or only show me messages from a certain originator, especially useful when looking at log files, we've got multiple originators writing to the same file. Or the last example they have over here by job ID. Hey, job number 248 is the one that's failing, so please just show me messages about that job. This is all very useful stuff to be able to get output that's meaningful for the problem at hand that you're trying to troubleshoot. Always remember, VX log view works with unified logs only. It does not work with legacy logs. There are some log analysis tools that ship with NetBackup that can be useful in analyzing the logs. The trace utilities, you see there's one of these for each type of activity in NetBackup, backups and restores and imports and verifies. They're designed to crawl through the logs for a particular activity you're trying to do. Say, for example, it's a backup job that's failing, and they'll collect information from multiple log files in one consolidated location to make it easier to, trace the path of the job as it goes from one process to the other and try to figure out where we're getting stuck and having problems. Also mentioned here, the NetBackup support utility and NBCP logs. The support utility gathers diagnostic information from your environment to look for areas outside of NetBackup that might be causing issues, that are causing jobs to fail, like communications problems from bad host files, for example. NBCP logs is a utility that's designed to gather up log files and zip them up and upload them to support. So NBCP logs is sort of a command line utility that does a similar function to the logging assistant we talked about earlier in the lesson. It's not nearly as robust as the logging assistant. It's simpler. It doesn't allow you to activate logs and change their verbosity and do that sort of stuff that the logging assistant does. But it's been in a product longer. This is sort of an older utility to try to add some automation to the process of gathering and uploading log files. Now let's talk a little bit about log management. When we talk about managing log files, a lot of times the argument gets distilled down to one big priority, which is managing disk space and not having the logs grow so large they threaten to fill up the file system. And so controlling log verbosity is a big deal. Now, I mentioned already I can go to the logging tab in NetBackup Master Server Host Properties, and I can see all of the controls here for my global logging level and for process-specific logging levels for some of those important logs. Note that the legacy logs are kind of in the first section there, and then underneath them there are 3 of the unified processes. I can change their verbosity from there for the debug level messages. Notice also that the keep logs for setting is here, and that by default I'll be keeping log files for 28 days. Note that the arrangement of controls has changed a little bit in 7.7 compared to previous versions. That keep logs for setting used to be on the cleanup tab. We moved it to the logging tab so that all of the logging controls would be in one place. This is also where you can activate the logging for critical processes, which I'll discuss in following slides. The logging for critical processes is a new feature in NetBackup, which allows you to have log files running continuously without consuming an excessive amount of disk space. And so when you enable critical logging, NetBackup activates the logs for certain processes it considers critical, and another way of saying that is log files that are most often useful in the troubleshooting process, and these are going to be active and running all the time, and we're going to have some retention settings for them. Because that's one thing about the legacy logs. With the legacy logs, I have this keep logs for setting, keep them for 28 days by default, and I have the ability to manually turn them off if I want to, and I can adjust their verbosity, and that's it. Those are the only controls I have with legacy logs, as opposed to the unified logs where I have all kinds of settings that I can configure through vxlogconfig to manage how big they get and when they roll over and how much space they're taking up and whether I'm doing automatic log recycling or not. And there's all kinds of settings for unified logs, and by default very few for legacy logs. And so the traditional behavior used to be keep them off all the time and only turn them on when you need them. And the problem there is that lengthens the amount of time it takes to resolve problems, because then I have to have this extra step of activating logs and recapturing information. It would be nice if, at least for the most important logs, I just had them on all the time, so I always have processes on hand. But I need rational controls to prevent them from getting too big and consuming too much disk space. And so the critical logging is going to help me out with that. These logs are going to be running all the time, and I've got additional methods of controlling their size that I didn't have in previous versions of NetBackup. So you'll notice that in addition to setting how many days I'm going to keep the logs for, I can also set for how big the logs are allowed to get. And so by default here, 25 gigabytes in size. That setting, by the way, is not directly associated with critical logging. In other words, I can activate that setting whether I'm using critical logging or not, but you can see how the two go together very well. The idea is I've got these settings to control how big the logs get, so having them running all the time doesn't pose a threat, that I might fill up the file system and get the server in trouble. Note that when we talk about the critical processes, that they're all legacy processes. Remember that unified logs are on all the time, so there's no need for similar functionality, and I can control how big the unified logs can get and how often they'll run over by using the vxlogconfig command. The keep logs for setting does apply to both types of logs. So unified logs and legacy logs both, have to follow that guidance. But it is probably a little bit more significant for legacy logs because these two settings here, the keep logs for and the keep logs up to, are my main means of regulating how big legacy logs can get. Whereas with unified logs, I've got other tools. So with the unified processes, I have the vxlogconfig utility that can be used to change their setting. So example here of changing the verbosity of the debug level messages to level 5 for a particular process. So verbosity is one thing I'm adjusting here. There's a number of properties that can be adjusted. The command reference guide will point out a lot of things that vxlogconfig does. It also controls, for example, how big log files are allowed to get, and if cleanup of logs through log recycling is activated by default. When you make changes to the configuration of unified logs, these changes are stored in the nblog.conf file. You can see the path to that configuration file on Unix and Windows here, and so making a change through vxlogconfig is essentially the same thing as editing that file. It is a best practice from Veritas to always use vxlogconfig, not to edit the file directly, just in case I make a typo or a boo-boo. I don't want to mess up the way logs work. But what you can do is you can make a change with vxlogconfig and then go over to that file and open it and look at it and see the effects of your change. Remember that unified log files can have settings applied to just one particular log, or you can apply a change to all of the logs, depending how you use the command. Also note that configuring PBX logging uses slightly different commands, and that's because PBX is associated with a different product. PBX is a shared Veritas tool that is used with other products besides NetBackup, and so although it is unified log, and it is very similar to the way the NetBackup logs, there are a few quirks, a few differences to its behavior. The reference tech note 44582 goes into more detail. Versions of NetBackup previous to 7.7 used to have a separate setting for what was called robust logging. And robust logging changed the names of legacy logs to make them a little more descriptive, and it gave you a little bit more control over when these files rolled over. Remember, the default behavior was that these legacy logs would just roll over at midnight. And robust logging is now enabled by default in version 7.7 and later. So it's not necessary to use this setting anymore. Setting doesn't actually appear in the admin console anymore, although it still might be in your bp.conf file if you've upgraded from an older version. And all robust logging ever did was, again, control rollover. And so you could use the vxlogconfig command with originator 112 to change the rollover for all of your legacy logs. And so the example shown here is we're going to configure the legacy logs to have no more than 10 files per process, and they can get no more than 15 megs each. Note that unlike unified logs, I can't do this per log when it comes to the legacy logs. I can only have this one setting, originator 112, and whatever changes I make to originator 112 apply to all of the legacy logs. But at least it gives me a little bit more control over what's happening. And that's it. The name is almost a little bit misleading. The fact that it's called robust logging makes you think maybe there's like some extra detail or other cool stuff like that there, and there isn't. It just controls the rollover. Now, we were just talking about how robust logging allowed us to control log file rollover for legacy logs. For unified logs, rollover is one of their properties, and you can change it from the default by using the vxlogconfig command. Unlike the legacy logs, with the unified logs, you can control rollover per log file if you want to. So all the logs can follow one value if that's how you want to do it, or you can have different settings for different logs. Maybe it's that you have, for very important logs, you keep them a little bit longer, or you let them grow a little bit bigger, that sort of thing. So here's some examples of some of the things I can do with the vxlogconfig command, starting with very simple things like just list all of the products on the host, or list the configuration options for a particular originator. And then we'll look at making some changes here. Here's an example of configuring NetBackup unified logs for a particular verbosity level, level 5 in this example. Or the next example, changing the log rollover. We'll do it based on file size, and we'll do it at 20 megs. Note that unified logs have different methods for handling this. You can do it by file size, or you can do it at intervals like every 8 hours, or you can do it at a certain time of the day, every day at noon, roll over the logs. You got a lot of flexibility here. Log recycling is whether or not NetBackup will go through and delete log files that are older than one of these thresholds or greater than one of these thresholds, depending on what the threshold is. For example, I set these logs maximum size 20 megs. Well, what happens when they get older than 20 megs? Do I want automatically the older log files to be deleted? If log recycling is set to true, then yes, that's what happens. If log recycling is set to false, then nothing happens automatically. I have to manually pare down the logs by running the vxlogmanager command with its delete function. Log recycling is generally desirable. It's better to have it as an automatic housekeeping type process, and so this is set to true by default. But if I wanted to have more control over it, I could set it to false, and then the cleanup wouldn't happen automatically. It would only happen when I manually ran vxlogmanager. Now, in terms of disabling debug logs, legacy logs can be disabled just by deleting the directory that contains the log. Be careful when you're doing this, never delete everything that's in the NetBackup log folder. You want the alt path and the user ops folders to persist if they're present. That's important stuff that NetBackup needs. Also, don't delete the makelogdir script because that's useful. That's the recommended method for creating log files. When it comes to unified logs, remember that unified logging cannot be shut off completely. If I needed to reduce the amount of unified logging that was happening, I would use vxlogconfig to reduce the verbosity of the debug and diagnostic level messages. Reduce it all the way down to 0 if you want to, and so that way, even though I can't disable the log, I will drastically reduce its size. And optionally, if things start to get really desperate, I can start using vxlogmanager with its delete function to purge logs to reclaim disk space. But if I find myself having to do that on any kind of a regular basis, I should probably consider, looking for a way to add more disk space to the server. Unified logs have the ability to be moved to a different directory other than the default. Legacy logs you can't, but unified logs you can. So maybe I want to copy these off to a different file system with more room if I find I'm constantly running out of space. Or another thing that sometimes folks will do is take the whole NetBackup logs directory and make it a mount point for another file system so that the logs are on another whole disk. And maybe that's a growable volume, and so that's cool if I ever run out of space. And the fact it's on a different volume means it's not on the root file system or the system disk, and that's nice, so if I do fill up the file system, I don't worry about bombing the server. Just remember that writing log files is important to NetBackup. If NetBackup is unable to write data to a log file, it can cause failed backup jobs and other unpredictable behavior. Unpredictable except that it will be bad. So always make sure there's some space for NetBackup to be able to write logs. Don't do risky things Like, for example, don't mount an NFS file system to the NetBackup logs directory, because then if you have any network hiccups, you can really jam up your NetBackup servers. In this last topic, we'll discuss capturing debug logs. A reminder first that debug logs are rarely our first troubleshooting step, and we've discussed this before in this lesson. We usually look for other sources of information like the reports in the NetBackup console first, and we kind of only turn to the debug log as a last resort. Now, the debug logs provide low-level details on NetBackup operations, very low level, and that may be exactly what we need to troubleshoot the problem, and so that's great when we need it. What we want to do usually is make sure that our logs are set properly and then duplicate the failure to make sure we get all the good information we need captured in the logs. When I'm deciding which logs to collect for analysis, I want to kind of think about which logs I need. So which NetBackup servers are involved in the problem, and which processes seem to be involved here. Those are the logs that I'll want to include. And so I'll want to consider the NetBackup process flow when deciding which ones to include. And I'll also want to make sure that I have enough resources available. So if I'm going to be doing verbose log collection, because I'm going to be sending logs to support, make sure I have enough disk space available to contain all of these logs. So here's an example of that decision-making process. I'm trying to figure out which logs will be most relevant for a particular job. In this case, status code 96, unable to allocate new media for backup. Now, if you've taken this entire course, hopefully you are already expert at this particular status code and would not need to go to the detailed log to correct it. However, if we're just to use this as an example here, we think about which processes are going to be most relevant for tape selection. And we think, this MDS process within NBEMM, the media and device selection, we said that was really the decision maker for which media gets used. MDS and NBRB are working together. So those are two very important logs. And, I might consider some other media manager logs like the DA component of NBEMM, the drive allocator, if I think that issues with job sharing might somehow be a factor. On the media server, the BPTM process, perhaps, because that's one that's supposed to be writing data to tape, so that's involved here. On the client, no, nothing really on the client that has anything to do with this. All of this resource allocation stuff all happens long before the client gets involved. NBJM, BPBRM, they're included here, and they would be included for just about any status code because they're the highest level logs on the master server and the media server, respectively. And so again, we mentioned that sometimes it's helpful to start at the top and work your way down when we're troubleshooting issues. When we're going to be providing logs to NetBackup support, make sure that what we're sending them is the raw log output. And so that means that the actual log file with verbose set to maximum, whether it's legacy or unified, it doesn't matter. We don't really want to be sending VX log view output to support. We want to be sending the whole file. So the VX log manager command could be used. VX log manager can collect log files for us and move them all to a temporary directory. I can use VX log manager to say, for example, get all the logs from the past 72 hours, copy them over to this temp folder, and then I'm going to compress them and send them to support. So that's cool. Also consider I also could use the logging assistant. The logging assistant would pretty much do everything on this slide for me in terms of collecting logs and getting them uploaded properly to support. Last thing I'll mention with the legacy logs, make sure the name of the log is very descriptive as to the server it's coming from and the role of that server and the process that's being logged and the time that it's logged. Some of that stuff is included in the default name of legacy logs and some of it is not. And so I'll want to make sure that the support engineer can tell at a glance where this log came from. All right, this came from a server called NYC NBU 27. So I'm also going to want to include what kind of server is that. Is it a master server or a media server or a client? And which process is it? Make sure all that stuff is visible at a glance. With unified logs, this is not so much of a big deal because they tend to already have very descriptive names by default, but legacy logs really don't. As an alternative to the logging assistant, NBCP logs is a utility that can be used to gather logs and send them to support. This is another utility that's nice because you don't have to know a lot about the log files or about how NetBackup works or anything like that in order to use this utility. Any log that's present on the server will be gathered by NBCP logs by default. Now, mind you, that's a lot of logs. So a lot of times, if I'm using this utility, it's because support has asked me to, and they may have given me a form of the command they want me to use, which gets less than the entire set of logs, where it just gets the logs for one process or one type of process, and maybe just for a certain period of time, not the default, which would be 24 hours by default. In this lesson, we learned about using the NetBackup logging assistant. We learned about the differences between legacy logs and unified logs, how to enable them, how to interpret them, and how to package them up and send them to support. And we also learned a little bit about log maintenance and different tools that are available for managing log files.